On the morning of October 25, 1944, lookouts aboard a small American escort carrier off the coast of Samar in the Philippines spotted something on the horizon that, for a long, disbelieving moment, nobody aboard could quite process. The unmistakable pagoda-style masts of Japanese battleships, closing fast, in numbers and firepower that simply should not have been anywhere near that stretch of ocean. The force those lookouts were watching approach included the battleship Yamato, the largest and most powerfully armed battleship ever built by any navy in history, accompanied by cruisers and destroyers in a formation that outgunned the small American task unit assigned to protect that patch of water by a margin that, on paper, made any organized defense look like a mathematical impossibility. The American ships present that morning were escort carriers, small, slow, thin-skinned vessels built to support amphibious landings, screened by a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts armed with weapons never designed to fight battleships at all. This is the story of what happened to the sailors of Taffy 3, the small task unit that, through a combination of desperate improvisation and almost unbelievable individual courage, fought the Imperial Japanese Navy's most powerful surface force to a standstill, using ships that had no business surviving the engagement at all. Here is the question worth carrying through this story. How do a handful of escort carriers and a few destroyers, armed with weapons built for shore bombardment rather than fleet combat, actually survive an encounter with the most powerful battle line Japan had left in the entire war? Ozawa's decoy force had been deliberately structured to attract exactly the kind of aggressive attention Halsey was known for, sacrificing what remained of Japan's carrier air power, by this stage of the war reduced to only a fraction of its earlier strength, following the catastrophic losses at the Battle of the Philippine Sea months earlier, specifically to lure the powerful American carrier fleet away from the actual main Japanese effort, converging on Leyte from multiple directions simultaneously. This broader Japanese plan, known as Operation Shogo, represented an extraordinarily complex, multi-pronged naval operation involving several separate Japanese fleet elements, approaching Leyte Gulf from different directions. A plan whose overall complexity and coordination difficulty across such vast distances made it vulnerable to exactly the kind of communication and timing breakdowns that ultimately shaped how the battle actually unfolded. It is worth noting the broader context of the Battle of Leyte Gulf within which this specific engagement occurred, since the overall battle, fought across several distinct actions over multiple days and involving nearly the entire remaining strength of both the American and Japanese Pacific fleets, is generally considered the largest naval battle in history by the total tonnage and number of ships involved, a scale that makes the specific, concentrated drama of Taffy 3's fight against Kurita's center force only one component, albeit one of the most individually dramatic and closely studied components, within an enormously larger and more complex overall engagement, spanning hundreds of miles of ocean. The circumstances that left Taffy 3 so catastrophically exposed traced directly back to a decision made the previous night by Admiral William Halsey, commanding the American Third Fleet's powerful force of fast battleships and fleet carriers. Believing the San Bernardino Strait, the passage through which the Japanese battle force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita would need to pass to reach the American landing beaches at Leyte, was adequately covered by other American naval forces. Halsey had taken his own powerful fleet north to pursue and destroy a Japanese carrier force under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, a force that, unbeknownst to Halsey at the time, had been deliberately deployed as a decoy specifically to draw the American battle fleet away from exactly the strait it needed to guard. This decision, still debated by naval historians today, as one of the most consequential and controversial command choices of the entire Pacific War, left San Bernardino Strait essentially unguarded at the precise moment Kurita's powerful surface force, having survived earlier American submarine and air attacks in the preceding days, emerged from the strait and found nothing standing between itself and the vulnerable American transport ships and landing forces at Leyte except Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's Taffy 3, a task unit built and equipped for an entirely different mission and never intended to face anything resembling the force now bearing down on it. The specific communications and command confusion that left San Bernardino Strait unguarded reflected a broader breakdown in coordination between Halsey's Third Fleet and the separate Seventh Fleet under Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid, which was directly supporting the Leyte landing operation. Kincaid, monitoring Halsey's movements through available communications, apparently believed Halsey had left at least a portion of his powerful battleship force behind, specifically to guard the strait, an assumption that, while reasonable given the information available to him, did not reflect what Halsey had actually done, since Halsey had committed his entire available battle force to the pursuit of Ozawa's carriers, leaving no American surface combatants of consequence covering the strait at all. These escort carriers, part of a broader class of vessels the Navy had produced in large numbers, specifically to fill the gap left by the far more expensive and time-consuming construction of full fleet carriers, represented an entirely different category of warship from the large, heavily protected carriers that had fought at Midway and the Philippine Sea, a distinction that mattered enormously once Taffy 3 found itself facing an enemy force built around genuine capital ships rather than the aircraft and submarines these smaller carriers had been specifically designed to counter in their intended amphibious support role. Sprague's command consisted of 6 small escort carriers, along with 3 destroyers and 4 smaller destroyer escorts, a formation built specifically to provide air support for the ongoing Leyte landing operation rather than to fight a major surface engagement against battleships and heavy cruisers. The escort carriers themselves were converted merchant hulls, slow and thinly armored, carrying aircraft armed primarily with bombs and rockets suited to ground support missions, rather than the armor-piercing ordnance that might have offered any realistic chance against heavily armored Japanese warships. The destroyers and destroyer escorts, while faster and more maneuverable, carried guns and torpedoes that, against the armor of a battleship like Yamato, represented a threat closer to an annoyance than a genuine danger under any conventional tactical calculation. Kurita's force itself had already endured a difficult approach to this point, having survived sustained American submarine attacks in the days before the battle that had already claimed several Japanese heavy cruisers, including Kurita's own original flagship, and having weathered heavy air attacks from American carrier aircraft the previous day that inflicted additional losses and damage, including the sinking of the massive battleship Musashi, sister ship to the Yamato, an ordeal that meant the force emerging through San Bernardino Strait that morning, while still formidable, had already absorbed serious losses and damage before ever encountering Taffy 3 at all. When Kurita's force appeared on the horizon that morning, Sprag faced a tactical situation with essentially no good options available. Retreat at the escort carrier's maximum speed would still leave them slower than the pursuing Japanese warships, and standing to fight directly offered no realistic prospect of survival against battleship-caliber guns capable of destroying an escort carrier with a handful of well-placed hits. Sprag ordered his carriers to turn and run downwind while launching every available aircraft, generating smoke screens to obscure the retreating carriers from Japanese gunnery observation. And, in the decision that would define the battle's entire subsequent character, ordered his small screen of destroyers and destroyer escorts to turn directly into the Japanese formation and attack. Sprague's own initial reaction upon spotting the Japanese formation reportedly combined genuine disbelief with the immediate, practical recognition that his task unit's survival depended entirely on decisions made in the following minutes, since there was no time to request reinforcement or await instructions from higher command before the Japanese force would close to effective gunnery range against his slower, thin-skinned escort carriers. The tactical situation demanded immediate, independent decision-making at exactly the moment the consequences of being wrong carried the highest possible stakes. A command pressure that several officers who served under Sprag later described as testing exactly the kind of decisive judgment naval officers trained for throughout their careers, but rarely experienced, applied under circumstances this immediately dire. Stop and consider what this order actually meant for the men aboard those destroyers, because it was, by any conventional naval calculation, close to a suicide mission. Commander Ernest Evans, captain of the destroyer USS Johnston, reportedly told his crew, upon receiving the order to attack, that they were going into a fight they had no reasonable expectation of surviving, and then led his ship directly toward the Japanese formation regardless, closing the range specifically to bring his torpedo tubes within effective firing distance of cruisers and battleships, many times his own ship's displacement and firepower. Evans himself, part Cherokee by heritage, and one of the relatively few Native American officers commanding a major warship at this stage of the war, had reportedly told his crew during earlier training that he intended to fight his ship aggressively if the opportunity ever arose, a stated intention that the morning of October 25th put to its most extreme possible test, and one he fulfilled completely, maneuvering the Johnston through the battle with a combination of aggression and tactical improvisation that several surviving crew members later described in terms bordering on disbelief at what their captain and their ship had actually managed to accomplish against such overwhelming opposition. The Johnston, along with the destroyers Howell and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, pressed home torpedo attacks against the Japanese formation, under a weight of return fire from battleship and cruiser main guns that most naval officers of the period would have considered simply unsurvivable for a vessel as small and lightly armored as a destroyer or destroyer escort. Samuel B. Roberts specifically, a destroyer escort even smaller and more lightly armed than the fleet destroyers accompanying her, fought with such aggressive determination against vastly superior firepower that she earned the nickname, among the sailors who survived watching her fight, of the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, continuing to engage Japanese cruisers with her small guns, even after sustaining damage that would have justified withdrawal by any reasonable standard of self-preservation. The aircraft flying from Taffy 3's escort carriers played their own critical and improvised role throughout the engagement, since the carriers had launched primarily with ordnance suited for ground support missions ashore at Leyte rather than anti-ship weapons, forcing pilots to attack Japanese cruisers and battleships with whatever bombs, rockets, or, in a number of documented cases, simply machine gun strafing runs they had available, tactics that inflicted only modest direct material damage against heavily armored warships, but that added continuously to the pressure and disruption Japanese ships had to contend with throughout the engagement's several hours of intense fighting. For Vice Admiral Kurita and his staff aboard the Japanese formation, the ferocity and persistence of the American resistance produced a specific and, in retrospect, consequential confusion about exactly what force they were actually engaging. The aggressive torpedo attacks from the American destroyers, combined with continuous air attacks from the escort carriers' aircraft, some of which continued making dummy strafing runs even after exhausting their actual ammunition specifically to maintain psychological pressure and force, continued evasive maneuvering from Japanese ships, created an impression among Japanese commanders that they might be engaging a considerably more powerful American force than the small escort carrier task unit actually present, possibly including fleet carriers and their more heavily armed escorts rather than the converted merchant hulls and lightly armed destroyers actually involved. Some historians examining Japanese accounts of the battle in the decades since have noted an additional factor likely contributing to Kurita's caution: the sheer disorientation of finding his formation under sustained, aggressive attack from a force that, by every prior Japanese intelligence assessment, should not have been anywhere near this specific position. A genuine tactical surprise that compounded the difficulty of accurately assessing the actual American strength present, since Japanese planning had not anticipated encountering any organized American naval resistance at this specific point in the operation at all. This confusion, compounded by the genuine damage and disruption the American attacks were inflicting despite the enormous disparity in raw firepower between the two forces, contributed directly to Kurita's ultimate decision, made after several hours of intense engagement, to break off the attack and withdraw rather than press forward to destroy the remaining American ships and continue toward the vulnerable landing beaches and transport ships at Leyte that had been his force's original objective. This decision, one of the most analyzed and debated command choices of the entire Pacific War, meant that Taffy III's desperate, costly resistance succeeded in its underlying strategic purpose, protecting the Leyte landing force, even though the tactical cost to the specific ships and sailors who fought the engagement directly was severe. The heavy cruiser Chikuma and several other Japanese warships sustained meaningful damage during the engagement from the combination of destroyer torpedo attacks and continuous airstrikes, losses that, while individually less catastrophic than the American ships sunk during the same fighting, contributed to the cumulative sense among Japanese commanders that continued engagement carried real and escalating costs against a force that, whatever its actual composition, was clearly not simply going to allow itself to be destroyed without extracting a serious price in return. The cost of the engagement fell heavily on the ships that had led the desperate destroyer attacks. The Johnston, having pressed her attack to point-blank range and sustained catastrophic damage from Japanese battleship and cruiser fire, eventually sank, with Commander Evans among those killed, an action for which he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The Howell and the Samuel B. Roberts were also sunk during the engagement, their crews facing the same desperate combination of overwhelming enemy firepower and the specific, harrowing experience of abandoning ship in open water while the battle continued around them. The escort carrier Gambier Bay, unable to outrun the pursuing Japanese cruisers despite Sprag's evasive maneuvering and smokescreens, was also struck repeatedly and sank, the only American aircraft carrier lost to direct surface gunfire from enemy warships during the entire Second World War. Crew members who survived the sinking of the Johnston later described the ship's final moments and the abandonment order with a specific, harrowing clarity. The ship listing heavily and under continued fire even as survivors attempted to get clear of the sinking hull. Conditions that made the process of abandoning ship itself a dangerous undertaking separate from the risk the ongoing battle continued to pose to men now in the water rather than aboard a fighting vessel. Similar accounts from Samuel B. Roberts and Howell survivors described comparable scenes of controlled chaos, damage control efforts continuing even as the order to abandon ship was given, and crews working to help wounded shipmates into the water, despite the ship's own increasingly precarious structural condition. Survivors from these sunk ships found themselves adrift in the waters off Samar for extended periods before rescue efforts could reach them. A hazardous wait, complicated by the presence of sharks in the surrounding waters, and by the sheer scale of the search area, given how scattered survivors became across the battle's chaotic aftermath, an ordeal that, while considerably shorter in duration than the catastrophe that would later befall the USS Indianapolis's crew the following year, shared the same basic elements of exposure, uncertainty, and danger that so many Pacific War naval disasters inflicted on the men who survived the initial engagement only to face a separate ordeal, simply staying alive in the water afterward. Rescue operations for Taffy III's scattered survivors were complicated by the ongoing broader naval battle continuing elsewhere in the region, and by the sheer number of men in the water across a wide area, meaning some survivors spent considerably longer periods awaiting rescue than others, depending on where their particular group happened to be located relative to the ships eventually dispatched to search for them. A variance in individual survivor experience that mirrored, on a smaller scale, the kind of scattered, uneven rescue timeline that would characterize the far larger and more prolonged Indianapolis disaster the following year. James Hornfischer's widely read history of the engagement, drawing extensively on survivor interviews and after-action reports from both American and Japanese participants, helped bring the specific human details of the battle to a broader popular audience decades after the fighting itself, presenting the engagement not merely as an abstract case study in naval tactics, but as a story of specific named individuals making split-second decisions under conditions of extreme danger, a narrative approach that has since shaped how the battle is generally remembered and taught, emphasizing individual heroism alongside the broader strategic and tactical analysis naval historians had already established in the decades immediately following the war. Kurita's decision to withdraw rather than press his overwhelming advantage has remained one of the most extensively analyzed command decisions in naval history, with historians offering a range of explanations, including the confusion about the actual strength of the American force he was engaging, concerns about running low on fuel and ammunition after the engagement's intensity, uncertainty about the broader tactical situation given the loss of reliable reconnaissance information, and a documented radio message received during the battle that seemed to suggest the broader Japanese naval operation was not unfolding as originally planned elsewhere. Whatever the precise combination of factors that ultimately drove his decision, the practical consequence was that one of the most powerful surface fleets Japan had remaining in the entire war withdrew from an engagement it was, by every conventional measure of relative firepower, winning decisively. A strategic outcome that historians studying the battle consistently attribute directly to the disproportionate cost and disruption Taffy III's desperate resistance had managed to inflict. Ernest Evans's Medal of Honor citation specifically recognized the aggressive, unrelenting nature of the Johnston's attack against overwhelming odds, an official recognition that, alongside similar decorations awarded to other officers and sailors who fought in the engagement, helped ensure the battle's specific tactical details and individual acts of courage received sustained historical documentation, rather than being absorbed into the broader, less individually examined narrative of the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf, of which the battle off Samar technically formed only one component engagement among several fought across a broader geographic area over multiple days. The battle off Samar, as the engagement came to be formally known, remains one of the most celebrated individual naval actions in the history of the United States Navy, specifically because of this extreme disparity between the forces involved and the outcome actually achieved, a case study in naval academies and military histories of how aggressive, coordinated resistance from a vastly outgunned force can, under the right circumstances, produce a strategic result that raw firepower comparisons alone would never predict. Halsey's own reaction upon learning of the crisis at Samar and the resulting scramble to redirect elements of his own fleet back south to assist added a further layer of controversy to the broader command decisions surrounding the battle, since the significant distance his fleet had already traveled north in pursuit of Ozawa's decoy force meant that meaningful reinforcement could not arrive in time to directly affect the outcome of the fighting off Samar itself, leaving Taffy III's survivors to credit their own resistance and Kurita's ultimate withdrawal, rather than any timely rescue by the main battle fleet, for the engagement's actual outcome. The destroyermen and sailors of Taffy III, many of whom had joined the Navy expecting the comparatively routine, lower-risk duty typically associated with escort carrier task units, rather than the direct fleet combat their ships had never been designed for, found themselves, through Sprag's decision and their own individual courage, at the center of one of the most consequential single engagements of the entire Pacific War. A battle whose outcome directly protected the American landing force at Leyte, and, by extension, the broader campaign to liberate the Philippines that Halsey's own controversial decision the previous night had nearly exposed to catastrophic disruption. Remember the question this story opened with: how do a handful of escort carriers and destroyers, armed with weapons never meant to fight battleships, actually survive an encounter with the most powerful battle line Japan had left in the war? The honest answer, drawn from the specific documented sequence of that morning's fighting, is that survival came down to a combination that no tactical manual could have reliably predicted: aggressive individual command decisions made under impossible odds, aircraft improvising attacks with the wrong ordnance simply to maintain pressure, and an enemy commander who, faced with resistance more ferocious than any reasonable calculation of relative firepower should have produced, chose caution over the decisive victory that was, by every conventional measure, his for the taking that morning. If you want to understand how a handful of escort carriers and destroyers, armed with weapons never meant to fight battleships, faced down the most powerful Japanese surface force remaining in the entire war and somehow forced it to withdraw, this is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater, told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.